especially read about church history, you come across these kind of weirdos during the Reformation period called the Anabaptists. And being someone who was kind of anti-authoritarian, I was like, I kind of like these people better than Luther and Calvin. Like, Luther and Calvin were, jailing people and working with the state. And these people were kind of didn't want anything to do with it. They were nonviolent. And so it's just, I think there was sort of an appeal there. I wasn't totally maybe on the pacifism train at that point, but I was interested in it. So I kind of always, I kept coming back to the Anabaptists because they were just such, I think, an interesting model of, so I'd like to say that the Protestant reformers said, we're going to go back to the Bible, sola scriptura. And then they got in a truck and they drove back to Augustine and they said, that's good enough. That's far enough. and I feel like the Anabaptists sort of said, no, we got to keep going. And so they sort of settled, especially like around the Sermon on the Mount. And they said, this is how Jesus tells us to live. And maybe this is how we should live. And where we see with a lot of the Protestant Reformation, and to some extent, Anabaptists could be considered Protestant, but they're also different. They're kind of outsiders. But the Protestants had this real tendency, I think, to look at like the Sermon on the Mount and say, well, there's some reason why we can't keep it. So maybe it's a model for how we should live ideally, but we can't live there because we're fallen. And so that's like one way to deal with it. So we don't really have to deal with it. Another way is like this kind of hyper dispensationalist viewpoint that says, well, this is how we'll live in the millennium, but it's not going to be how we live now. And then Luther does this kind of weird, I don't know if this is ableist to say, but like a schizophrenic sort of thing where he sort of says, well, insofar as we are Christians, we can't be taking up the sword, but there's another, almost like a second person in us that can, because that person is a citizen. And so as citizens, we can kill, and as citizens, we can pillage and rob, but we can't actually do that as Christians. And so I feel like the Anabaptists had this really kind of whole person idea here about how this was supposed to be approached.